Welcome to Once Upon a Real Life with Belle, where history, mystery, and real-life stories will come together. Today's episode takes us to the enchanting grounds of the Caboolture Abbey Museum, a hidden gem of curiosity nestled in Queensland's Moreton Bay region. I'm joined by the passionate and knowledgeable Senior Curator, Michael Strong, and CEO, Edith, who shares the extraordinary story behind the Abbey's beginnings, its fascinating collection of artefacts and the spiritual legacy of its founder, John Ward. We'll explore the links between medieval history and mysticism, discover the rare relics housed in this unique museum, and hear all about one of Australia's most iconic cultural events, the Abbey Medieval Festival. So dust off your imagination, step back in time with us. This is an episode where the past truly comes alive. Welcome, Michael. Welcome, Edith. The relics you've got in this museum, I did not know existed.
I think that's what a lot of people do. They sort of think, Abbey Museum, that's going to be a religious museum. But in fact, it's not. It's a museum of world history, which covers the last million years of humankind, the human story, and covers so many different sort of cultures and countries as well.
So you're telling me you've got artefacts that are up to 1 million years old here?
1.2 million years, if you want to be exact, which come from Africa. A lot of our material, of course, revolves around the Middle Ages, which fits in very nicely to the Abbey Medieval Festival, and it's something which is very popular. But we also, of course, have material from ancient Egypt, have material from ancient Mesopotamia. We have China, Japan, ancient Rome, Greece, the Etruscans. It's a smorgasbord of history in many ways. It's like a mini British museum without having to go through the size of one of their galleries.
You would imagine these relics to be in London. This is where I would imagine what I've just seen in your museum. I would imagine it should be over there. But to have it here, what a special thing for Queensland.
But although it's here in a rural setting in Caboolture, we also have like an international outreach that goes across. So we've had, for example, researchers from the University of Jerusalem come out for the last 3 years to look at just one crumbling Mesopotamian clay tablet from Mesopotamia. And they're there because on the last line of it, it says, and they buried the great king in the garden. And that's talking about Alexander the Great being buried in the city, in the Hanging Gardens in Babylon. And that's one of the few documents in the world, probably the only document in the world where you've actually got something, a piece of information of that written down. So, clay tablets, although they don't look particularly interesting things, once, as you just sort of said, they can take you back into history, into another world, which, is just so incredible. I think sometimes you walk into the museum and you just had this sense of timelessness, that sort of, the population of Britain when our first artefacts were being made was around about 300 people. And, and then it went down to 30 people probably during the time of the Ice Ages. And so, over time, our world has changed. And today we're standing at a precipice in some ways of where are we going in the next 100 years.
Wow. And Michael, you've been here since the building was built in 1986. It was opened in June 86?
Yes. The Abbey community appointed me as their first director of the museum. At that time, a collection largely in packing crates still and very poorly researched back in 1980. And slowly we were able to get a grant from the Utah Foundation, one of the largest grants they had given at the time, and a number of other major organisations, philanthropic organisations in Australia. And we raised about $1 million, which built the archaeological gallery. And that sort of was opened in 1986.
So you're saying you had a bunch of crates, you knew they were priceless artefacts, but we weren't 100% sure what they were at the time?
Absolutely. So much so that we actually were writing to places like the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum in England and institutions all around the world. And I remember the curator of Roman British antiquities said to me one day, Michael, you may think the British Museum has been designed to actually research the objects in the Abbey collections. We do have some other things to do as well. We do have some other things to do as well. Having said that, she laughed and sort of said, look, we'll do our best. We know how hard it is for you to find comparative material to work on. And without that support, that enormous support from around the world, and also from the Queensland Museum, which was helped, with their staff coming out and working on the collections, we wouldn't have the wonderful museum that we had today.
Incredible. So tell me about the origins of the museum itself. I believe it started in England, then it moved to Cyprus, then it moved to Australia in the Blue Mountains, and then finally ended up here in Queensland.
Yes.
Tell me about the beginnings.
Do you know, it's a very strange thing, Belinda, should you say that, because one day, 97, a 10-year-old boy walked into the British Museum with a pocket full of Roman coins and prehistoric flints, and he found a friendly curator there, who sort of took pity on this young lad, took him into his office and sat him down, looked at his findings that he'd made, and out of that, one kindly gesture was born something which today attracts 25,000 people to the medieval festival and thousands of people over here in distant Australia. And if it hadn't been for that one moment, it's just one of those drops of stone that's thrown to a pool and the ripples go out, and you never know where it's going to go. And the actions that you do will never tell you what results may come from that process. So we're all sitting here today because of that one single moment this man did.
Incredible that it was a flint that sparked it.
And a Roman coin that he dug up in his garden as well. And out of that was born a lifelong fascination with antiquities. And so Ward, after he went through Cambridge University, went out to Burma as a brash young imperialist, believing this is the time of the British Empire. And he really believed, sort of that the world resolved around Britain. And found, I think, to his amazement and possibly his confusion a little bit too, that there were civilizations thousands of years older who'd been sort of like trying to understand the human story, the nature of life, the nature of things, why we have evil in the world or sin in the world, or, why we have sort of, where there's good, why are some people born on a rubbish heap and some people born, with a silver spoon in their mouth. And so for John Ward as a young man, he grappled with a lot of these problems. He became very much involved with the Freemasons, which is a group of people who had multi-faith viewpoints, so they believed in humankind. That humanist sort of viewpoint, I think, in many ways guided and shaped his life. But he was also deeply interested in Buddhism and Hinduism. In fact, at one stage, he nearly became a Buddhist. And there's a tradition within the Abbey. He actually went in India. He actually became part of an Indian temple for a short time. And he certainly was given quite a number of very precious things while he's in that time, which we still have in the museum today. And out of that process, I think, he then sort of went back to England and taught for a little while in schools. But then in 1929 is probably a thing, he formed a small utopian community, the Confraternity of the Kingdom of Christ, it was known as, which is just men and women coming together in a semi-monastic sort of way of life, but living up to a number of ideals which John Ward and his wife Jessie had put into place. And they formed a small group at a place called Hadley Abbey at New Barnet, outside London. And in 1934, Ward was able, very serendipitously, to combine his spiritual life, which he had, with the creation of Britain's first social history museum, the Abbey Folk Park, an open-air museum. And he was astonishing. And this is where, in many ways, his legacy, I think, has been sort of like a little bit overlooked, perhaps, but he was the first person to create replicas of prehistoric buildings. Now, today we know that a lot of the cultures that he understood were what people were thinking of in the 1920s and 1930s. But today, a lot of those cultural processes have changed. We've got different understandings through excavations and all the scientific processes we can bring to place today. But he was certainly, these buildings that he built absolutely transformed the way that people educators were looking at museums. So George Bernard Shaw, for example, was a visitor to his open air folk park, and he had hundreds of people, thousands of people came to his first exhibition. It was so successful, they decided to continue it. And at the same time, he'd built a small little abbey chapel from a 14th century barn that he'd pulled down and turned it into a chapel. And he filled that with priceless stained glass.
I saw that. The stained glass was beautiful. Are any of them in this room that we're in right now?
All the glass that's in here was once some of the glass that was in here, the saints' windows, the Gothic Revival glass was in the Abbey Chapel. Most of it was in a small building called the Oratory of the Angels, which must have been absolute veritable treasure house of colour when you walked in. So all the glass that had come from Winchester Cathedral, the fragments that had been saved from Winchester Cathedral, were in this one single building, together with some heraldic panels from Ettington, the mortuary chapel at Ettington. And it's only just recently we've actually understood a rather vague sort of comment that Ward made to an old workman saving medieval glass, to realise the real story, because Ward was he'd never let the facts get in the way of a good story from time to time, that this was actually a man who's Alfred Tomlinson, who was the second in command of the great company, great stained glass company of Charles Kemp. And he had loved medieval glass, and when they were pulling them out during the late Victorian period and replacing them with modern Victorian windows, he saved the medieval glass, and his windows are still here in the Abbey Church today. So it's incredible. So this is a discovery that we only sort of like made. And so we have here fragments of stained glass, a lot of stained glass from Winchester Cathedral. I think they're quite 28 panels. And so we have probably outside of, if you go, well, in fact, if you go to, as I was just saying earlier on, if you go to the great Norman Cathedral of Winchester today and walk into the cathedral, the guides talk about the little church at Caboolture, which has so much of our stained glass.
The feeling I had when I walked in today, it was like you just said, the colour just pops. 28 stained glass windows that I know are from what year?
1510.
And do you think that he didn't have to pay for them? They were donated to him?
No. That's where Ward was such an amazing person. They were going to be sold to probably the cloisters in Metropolitan Museum in New York. We think that's where we think it was going. And he raised a public benefits fund to keep them in Britain.
Brilliant.
And so he actually had a wealthy Sheffield industrialist who was a Freemason and gone with him to Cambridge University, of course. So it's an old boys' club in many ways, came together. Connections, it's not what you know, it's who you know. He sort of was able sort of like to encourage him to find the money to pay for it. Yeah. It went into, of course, into the Abbey Church, and then sort of like 12 years later, it left and went and came to eventually to Australia. But it's a marvellous legacy to have, and we spend a lot of our time trying to understand the fragments that we have, and as you saw in the gallery, for example, some of the important pieces that we've been able to put back together again.
So I also read that the Queen of England donated some items to John Ward.
Yes.
Or did he purchase those?
No. Queen Mary became a patron of the Abbey Folk Park, and she donated a large number of very nice late Victorian objects, which are in display have always been part of the Abbey's collection and is on display today.
And what are they?
Tea caddy, beautiful lacquered writing desk, little souvenirs, a beautiful little tray done by a fairly sort of significant sort of female artist of her day. But it's also interesting because in some ways, Queen Mary was one of those people where people tucked away their precious things when she was coming to visit, because she had a bad reputation for being a Robin Hood type of person, taking from one group of people and then giving them to somebody else. So she came out of it with sort of, glowing colours, but at the same time. But anyway, just having that sort of that connection. And the intelligentsia of Britain crowded around the folk park. It was such an incredible educational experience for students to come, and Ward was there, walking around sort of like talking about these things and raving on about it, and people just absolutely loved it.
I watched the video as I entered the museum, and he really does seem to love and thrive the open air museum. All of the photos that he's in with grand groups of people and particularly children, and he is dressed like a reverend.
Yes. His father was an Anglican clergyman. He was Anglican at the time of the folk park.
Yeah.
And then eventually, fortunately, his inspired sort of like preaching sort of like in the little Abbey Chapel sort of started to take too much money away from the local church in Barnet. Yeah. And so there was an extensive correspondence between the Archbishop of Canterbury, which Jeff found when he was doing his book, trying to understand sort of like, what they could do about him. And they finally tried to shut him up a little bit. Ward was talking about something he actually believed in. And that was the difference, I think. He really believed genuinely that spirituality and energy that moves through the universe actually has a physical and scientific process. So a lot of things that he talked about was trying to find a way of marrying science and spirituality together. So he wrote a book, for example, The Psychic Powers of Christ, talking about the psychic phenomena of what he believed was the gospel. It is, yes. And I think that in some ways then the establishment almost like turned against him a little bit. How it happened, we're still not sure. And eventually one of the young women who had joined the community became subject to an antiquated medieval legal lawsuit from her parents, in which said that a girl or a woman, a daughter, owed all her income to her parents. So it was actually a thing that to her father. In fact, so all her income that she made, money she made, was actually the property of her father. And they sort of then charged Ward with taking away their livelihood by this girl, joining his community. The laws changed, in fact, soon afterwards, but it became, a cause to celebrate, sort of like in pre-war and post-war, sort of like England. And I think there's a newspaper, one of the newspapers had, like so many million people died in the concentration camps in Germany, so many steammen and ships were wrecked in the thing. John Ward loses the court case on the front page. So that's how powerful it was his day. And Ward expected his Masonic friends, because he was the leading third leading Mason in England, to come and support him. They all walked away.
They disappeared. So it was too out there, too woo-woo.
Yeah. Look, Ward was himself, he was a charismatic person, but he was also slightly eccentric as well. There's no doubt. I sometimes often wondered whether or not sort of the court case, what it actually did to his balance of mind. His early writings are brilliant and deep, discerning and far-thinking. I think as he got a little bit old, as he went through the court case, he had something more of a persecution complex that emerged and came out of it. And at the end of that process, and they come to the war, and the community were virtually bankrupted by the court case and the fact of having no income coming through, that they decided it was time to leave England.
And that was 1945?
Yes.
So we're talking about at the end of the war as well.
The war.
So we've been through some tough years, and then the court case, and he's struggling.
And he was a sick man too. He wasn't a well man. He may have even had a stroke, we think, at that time as well.
And then we moved to Cyprus, the whole community?
Yes.
And how many people would be in the community at that point?
About 10, yes.
And we ship all the antiquities?
Yes. Well, no, sadly, if only that was true.
Yeah.
All the big, spectacular objects largely were sold, the carriages and the suits of armour and the red figureware vases and the books of hours, which today would be worth an absolute fortune. I look at some of the photographs of what was in the collection, and it was just astonishing that somebody who wasn't a rich man could put together such an amazing sort of number of antiquities. And we have really the nucleus of what didn't get sold and what was left.
And the buildings, when he had the open air museum, there was 30 homes that he had acquired or built. Did they all get sold and removed, or are they still there today? It's
a really amazing thing. There's this amazing sort of process that happened where after the folk park was bought by a man called an antique collector called William Oley, who then turned it into the Abbey Art Centre, and it's still functioning as the Abbey Art Centre today, much reduced in size from what it was then. All the prehistoric village, as they called it, has been destroyed, has disappeared under a housing estate.
Yeah.
But in some incredible way, Australian artists, people like Leonard French, for example, going across to stay in England to study, went and stayed in the Abbey Art Centre. And the Abbey Art Centre ended up, the Abbey Folk Park ended up coming to Australia. So it's quite extraordinary.
Unbelievable. Now, Cyprus, we're in Cyprus.
So Cyprus, they arrived virtually penniless, virtually starving. They had no money at all, virtually. They lived on grass and nuts and fruits, things they could manage to salvage, and the goodwill of the local populace who gave them bits of cheese and things like that. And eventually they found that the land that they'd been given was actually not suitable, and they moved to another sort of property which gave them a little bit more where they could start to keep goats and chickens. And that's what I was saying about perhaps Ward was affected by the court case, because he writes affectionately of these goats and these chickens in his diaries that he wrote, as well. And then he'd go on to talk about world affairs and what was happening in Russia and what was happening
Vastly different early days
Yeah.
and his learnings and teachings of the early
Did he stop collecting objects? No. Although they were penniless, he was going out there and still buying icons and pieces of pottery from the Nicosia Museum, the museum in Nicosia.
Unbelievable. And so what was the move to the Blue Mountains? How did all of these antiquities end up here?
So there's just one little backstory before that, and that is that also they had started having children in Cyprus. So that's where I was born into the community in Cyprus. So that's where I reach back into the community's history as well.
Stop. Hang on. Rewind. What's your connection? Michael,
As a member of the community in Cyprus. So I was born to one of the members of the community in Cyprus. So, and there's a few people still left who survived that journey, and are still part of the community as well. And so they then sort of like, the problem was that there was a terrorist or a freedom organisation, whatever you want to call it. If you're British, you call it a terrorist organisation. If you're sort of Greek, you call it sort of freedom fighters. And they wanted to unite the island of Cyprus with Greece, and they formed this terrorist organisation, which then started killing English people, and it became unsafe to stay in Cyprus. And so that was the catalyst that moved them from Cyprus, went to Egypt, went to Sri Lanka, where the Maharaja of Hyderabad invited the community to go and make a settlement in Egypt because it's right in India, thanks, Edith, because he had known John Ward at Cambridge University. And it's just amazing that sort of, 40 years after that had occurred, he obviously had enough attraction from other people that they still wanted to support him in some ways. It's extraordinary. But that wasn't really good because India was in a nationalist movement and sort of separation from Pakistan. And so they eventually came to Australia and arrived and spent the first night, I think, sleeping on benches in Hyde Park because they had no money.
And you were there?
Yeah, as a child, yes.
How old were you, Michael?
5.5, 6.
Do you have any memory?
Oh, yes.
And
I can remember
how many-
Cyprus. I can remember Cyprus quite well.
How many in your group
So
came across?
six children and about 8 adults. Yes, some of them died in Cyprus, some of them didn't survive in Cyprus.
My mind is blown that you are 5 or 6 years old. You're sleeping on benches in Sydney. Where are all of these antiquities?
In crates, in somebody's private garage in Sydney, in Bondi. Yes.
Then
Remarkable story.
it is the most amazing story. So 6 kids, 8 adults, bunch of priceless crates, and a story that's phenomenal.
So when they left, it's interesting because when they left England, they thought that they were going to go to, first of all, the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, then to New Zealand. And so they went equipped. They packed everything they possibly could away that would allow them to be self-sufficient.
And this was 1951.
It says 1945.
45, okay. Back in 45.
That's what kept them alive in Cyprus, living on oxo cubes, which are like meat cubes in tins, like spam type of stuff, It's just astonishing. So that's what kept them alive. They used most of the tools that they'd taken with them. And when they ended up coming to Australia and eventually here to Caboolture, those tools were what actually which had been packed away 20 years earlier, or what actually allowed them to survive.
Michael, are all of these artifacts like family to you?
I could say that I've had a very lifelong association with them, that's for certain. And they do. I mean, in many ways, they're incredible pieces.
What is your favourite? What is the one that you are just so intrinsically aligned with and you just love it? Your favourite piece in this museum gallery?
A little Tang flute player from the Tang dynasty in China. She's a little flute player. She's just holding a side-blown flute, and you can almost visualize her, this young girl with a beautiful butterfly headdress, coming out of the shadows and just sitting down and just trying to play this haunting flute music in a tomb somewhere. And she's got this lovely striped silk dress of red and green, which is now faded just back almost to the pottery itself. But she's 1,200 years old.
Is she porcelain?
Pottery.
Pottery.
Painted pottery.
I'm going to take a photo of that before I leave today.
Yes. So look, but what can you say? There's a piece of glass behind us which looks most hardly important at all, and yet it's the only remaining fragment from one of the great windows that were put into the Lady Chapel in 1490 in Winchester Cathedral.
Now, Edith, that story of Michael's just is mind-boggling to me. Now, what is your connection to the museum?
Well, I was also born into the community. So my parents joined the community in England, but I wasn't born until they arrived here in Australia, and I was born in the Blue Mountains in Blackheath. And so my journey was also growing up with the community when the community moved to Queensland in 1965. Many, many years of establishing the farm that we have here. So initially, that's what the community did. It farmed. That was how it supported itself, starting with growing small crops of tomatoes. We were actually, because this year the community is celebrating its 60th anniversary. So we're going back and looking at the history and talking to some of the young members like Michael who grew up, but at that stage they were working a farm with tools that came from England, and they had, you know, just digging the ground. It was very pioneering in so many ways, you know, and so I grew up in that. I went to school in Queensland, and whereas Michael's generation were all homeschooled, but I went to school. We always used to say whenever the community was clearing some land to have more crops, it would always happen just before the school holidays. We would spend our school holidays picking up sticks, clearing the land and
Working.
working. And it was very pioneering. We had no running water. I remember as a young child, one of my daily jobs was going to the well and using a hand pump to pump the water, which was then taken to a copper to heat up for bathing and washing and things like that.
That's here.
That was here.
Where we are.
Absolutely.
Where the museum is.
Yes. Yeah.
So your mum or your dad was on that Cyprus trip that came across to Sydney?
Both of them.
Both of them.
Yeah. So I obviously went to school, and then after I finished school, I started working on the farm with the community, and I was doing small cropping for pumpkins, potatoes, sweet potatoes, which is like part of the community work. And we also then had duck farm for a while, and then and a herb garden. So I grew all the vegetables for the community and herbs all organically at the time. I was very much into self-sufficiency. So I did pottery and spinning and weaving, you know, a real... I felt like a hippie, but out of time. But eventually I started taking tours of the church here, the stained glass windows, and talking about the history. And I love stained glass as an art form because it's the one art form that needs light coming through it to see the beautiful colours, you know, and so something magical about that. And it was a great way of telling stories to people. And then eventually I took over the running the museum. And
Michael went up to become an archaeologist.
Yes, Michael did. And
so Michael became an archaeologist,
yes.
And you, Edith, took on all of this
museum and growing it and developing it from having like a few hundred people a year to schools, developing school programs. So we have a very active program for students. I think how it came about was I used to see students go around the museum and find it difficult to engage. And I said, we need something really hands-on so they can have an immersive experience, something that touches them in a way that they don't forget it. Yeah. And so we started an archaeological dig, and we dug a hole in the ground, and we actually did an Anglo-Saxon dig to start off with because I kind of liked the Anglo-Saxon, so it was something that I liked.
So what's in there? Pottery
and metalworks. There was like helmets and swords and things like that.
Kids are going to love this, and you know they're never going to forget that excursion they went on.
That's right.
I saw today what was happening in the in the manuscript gallery.
Yeah.
With
And today when I came into the museum, I could hear children and I could hear squeals. And what they were doing was learning mummification. So I popped my head around the corner and there's about 30 children in there completely loving watching one of their fellow students being pretended to be mummified.
Yeah. You know, and I think that, so we have an Egyptian dig. So the program that you saw was part of their Egyptian studies. So we have an Egyptian dig now where there's a big sarcophagus or a coffin. It's got a mummy inside that's all wrapped up, and all the artifacts that you would find if you were going into an Egyptian tomb around it, like shaptis and canopic jars and different bowls and a whole range of bits of furniture and things like that. So students come, the site is gridded up, and then they excavate it and they record what they find, just like you would, well, probably it would be a super lovely dig if you actually found that amount of artifacts,
wouldn't it?
Real life.
And I know that, Michael, I know that your history has got the archaeological finds in Brisbane. I know you found things in the barracks. And I think this here, you would have had a hand in that, and these children are going to learn so much by coming here. And then tell me, what's your favourite item, Edith? In the entire museum, what's your favourite?
No, it's really hard to say that because there's so many things that I walk around and I look at and I go, that's just remarkable. But I think I would also go to the Chinese case, and there's one that I always pick out where there's a little glass snuff bottle. It's about, 5 centimeters high, and on it is painted this beautiful crane, this beautiful bird standing beside a little bit of a lake. But what you don't realize is that the painting is done on the inside of the bottle. So it's painted backwards using a paintbrush with sometimes just a single hair, and they paint backwards inside the bottle. And I find that just amazing. It's just,
Humans can be incredible.
and that's what I like about the museum is, like, we run this medieval festival, and we started that back in the late 1980s, and it was a fundraiser for the museum. But when I started taking over managing it, I wanted it to have a degree of authenticity, because we're a museum, it's about education, it's about inspiring people. And so many people came and said to me, oh, they were in the Middle Ages. They couldn't do things. Everything's rough. And the people not understanding the human ingenuity, the human creativity, the magnificence of what people were creating in the Middle Ages, or even before that, like going to Egypt and seeing the incredible pyramids or the painted tombs. Stunning what humans have created throughout history and from the earliest times. And I love telling that story. I love using our museum to inspire people to say, as human beings, we have a capacity to be creative. We have a capacity to inspire and reach for something way better.
I agree 100%. Now, you've just completed this year's Medieval Festival now, 2 weeks ago perhaps?
Yeah.
And how many did you have along to that festival?
And around 25,000 people.
And I saw some videos. There was horses and jousting, and there was catapulting, and there was all.
Yeah.
It was a wonderful. I'm going to come next year. I'll be here.
You must.
Dressed up.
It is a great experience. And again, what we were looking at was, we want you, when you walk through that door, to go, wow, and be like you're stepping back into history, like a totally immersive experience where you can go to the Stag Inn and you can have a drink.
Is it mead?
Mead or cider, and have a venison mulled wine, a venison pie. You could go learn dancing. You could listen to a lecture on medicine in the Middle Ages. You can watch fighting displays, learn dances, see medieval music being played, like using a hurdy-gurdy and strange instruments that people just go like, what is that? We have a wonderful group of people, medieval reenactors, musicians, performers, who come and share their love and passion of history that has been partly inspired by what we've created, so that it is so immersive that people just can't understand. Like, yes, they're all smiling. There's very few people who walk out going, well, that was a boring day.
Michael, you've got a brand new Abbey art gallery. Tell me about this. This has just recently opened in February.
Yes, the result of many years of dreaming, blood, sweat and tears, we say, because it's taken us a long time. We've gone through a number of iterations before we could come up with this final design. So it's a remarkable gallery, which is for the first time has allowed us to put our artworks on display, objects which haven't seen the light of day since they were packed away in England, to come out on display for the first time. And it's a priceless collection in many ways, which has a number of well-known sort of artists, Hont Horst, Sassoferrato, Rubens, amongst them, in a small area. But the gallery itself is also reaching back to the very beginnings and foundations of the Abbey, in the fact of the Abbey Folk Park and John Ward's vision, in that it's called inspired images. It's, the arts of faiths. So it's about how human beings, in different times and places, have perceived divinity. So it starts off with some rock paintings from Australia, 17,000 years, and it goes to a beautiful, sort of like old, and it goes to a statuette from Iran of a female goddess, which is 4,000 years old. And then looking through there, you can sort of see mothers and childs, Madonnas and childs from Western Europe, sort of like in a whole range of paintings which go around. And its centerpiece is a wonderful sculpture dating about 1500 to about 1550 of, they're called the Lamentation, which is about the placing of the body of Jesus after crucifixion into the tomb with Joseph of Arimathea. And it's got some wonderful sort of like stories associated with that.
What a beautiful gallery it is too. Now, the pieces of art that are collected there, did John collect those as well?
Yes. So almost 99% of them were collected by John Ward in 1929. So that's preceding the folk park.
Yeah.
It's just at the beginning when he was forming that small community to start off, which became eventually the Abbey Community. And they were all acquired from one art dealer in London. Our researcher went back there to talk to them this year and found that they can't actually tell us who they bought them from for another 4 years, because it's 100-year caveat on, so on, be able to say where they'd acquired them from.
In
4 years' time, we're going to send her back over there to London. She can go to them and say, okay, now tell us where it is. But some of them, on the backs of them, have got some wax seals with an impressed double-headed eagle, and that's usually considered to be the symbol of Imperial Russia. And when you think that the Russian Revolution happened in 1917 to 1923, basically a lot of Russian families then emigrated to England because of the relationship between the Tsar and Queen Victoria. And after a time, they're starting to run out of money. We'll have to sell some of our paintings. And that's how these wonderful works of art came on the market.
And do you still now collect new pieces, and how do you do that?
We rarely buy any objects. We have from time to time, just to try and find an educational piece that's going to be more educationally useful. But today we really rely on donations. So just recently, about 3 months before the gallery opened, we had the donation of a wonderful new artwork, a glazed ceramic of the Vision of St. Hubert, given to us by a barrister from the Sunshine Coast. And it took 12 years of negotiation for it finally to be donated, but it's finally arrived here. And it's wonderful because the original drawings for this work are in the Louvre in France, and we have the final artwork here in Caboolture. And so it's a wonderful thing. In many ways, it encapsulates what we've been talking about, because it is a mystical story reaching back to John Ward's mysticism. It's about the Middle Ages, and we have the largest medieval festival in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
And it is a work of art that fits perfectly in, because of its spiritual connections, into the whole gamut, the whole umbrella of the Abbey community and the Abbey Museum.
And humankind.
And humankind,
The
yes.
biggest
Yes.
draw is the unbelievable items you have in the museum and the history that comes with it. Do you still garden? Do you still eat off the land?
Long gone.
Long gone.
We've really become an educational, cultural and spiritual hub.
Now, I'm going to ask you one last question, and I have a feeling this will be a good one for you guys with all of your mysticism. I ask every guest this at the end of the episode. I'll start with you, Michael. I'll come to you, Edith. Have you ever seen a ghost? Or in your life?
Yes.
Tell me.
Well, we actually had a very kind. We had a group of Ghostbusters come to do a program at the Abbey Museum, and we were very reluctant. The board looked at it very seriously. Do we want to have people like Ghostbusters coming here to the museum? But eventually they decided it was in the tradition of John Ward, so they might as well go ahead and do it. And these guys were very, very sincere about what they did, and they brought a lot of equipment with them. But one of the things they did was to bring some stainless steel balls, that size of ping pong balls, and they put them near some of the displays because they believed that if there was a spirit energy moving around, then something would happen. We sat and looked at these balls for about an hour in front of one of the displays, I think the Japanese sword display, which we know has actually killed people. And suddenly, without everyone was like, 3 or 4 meters away, one of the balls started to move the thing and then do a right angle bend and stop. Now, whatever that is, it certainly makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up on end. Because we've been sitting up there, it's 9 o'clock in the night time, and this suddenly happened. It happened in 2 places in the museum.
Unbelievable. So what about you, Edith?
I probably know. I've not seen anything. I have certainly felt things, like going into the museum at night.
That's what I was thinking. That is where I was going.
There are times when I have literally run out of there because I get this sensation that it's like suddenly this, I don't know, almost like a fear comes, like, oh my gosh, I can't stay in here, because it's like there is an energy or a feeling in there that is overwhelming. So I certainly felt, things that gives you shivers down your spine.
And that energy that's in there would have known you your whole life. So it's interesting that they're chasing you out. It's bedtime, Edith. Get out.
But it is. There is there's so many stories connected to the objects, the artifacts in the collection there.
Well, that's psychometry, right? Like that's like items hold history.
And energy.
And energy.
Yeah.
So I've never seen a ghost, but I ask this to all of my guests because it's probably maybe 70-30 now that have. I have never. I also say, have you seen a UFO? I better throw that question. No, neither have I. Only 2 have said yes to that one.
Yeah. No.
Thank you so much for allowing me today to come into your museum. Yeah. So it took 50 minutes from Brisbane to get here today.
And we have a cafe.
And you have
a cafe.
I'm about to buy a Monte Carlo biscuit as I leave today. Thank you so much, Michael Strong. Thank you so much, Edith Cuff. It is an amazing museum. The history, you can feel it walking in there, like you say. And that gallery, I'm about to go back in and have a better look at.
Thank you. Thanks, Belinda.
Thank you so much.